Of course, everyone's familiar with this quote from Baha'u'llah. It's incumbent upon everyone, even should he be resident in a particular land for no more than a single day, to become engaged in some craft or trade or agriculture, and that the very pursuit of such a calling is, in the eyes of the one true God, identical with worship. So I've been a Baha'i since 1980. I got my PhD in science education from the University of Texas. I lived in Texas for many years, and I moved to Alaska in 1993, where I lived for 10 years. And then in 2004, we moved to Montana. And I've been in Montana since 2004. Here's the names of some of the books I wrote while I lived in Texas. So when I first moved from from the lower 48 to Alaska, weeds and invasive plants weren't really being talked about very much in the lower 48. And when I came back in 2004, it's like there's this big sea change of much, much more concern about invasives than there had been before. And many plants that I loved for their beauty or food value were now considered invasive nuisances or weeds. For example, dandelions, which I love. Everybody loves dandelions, right? The Denver, Colorado at one point encouraged the growing of dandelions and considered it like the town flower. And now it's considered a weed. During the Depression, my mother would gather the leaves of dandelions for salad. So I had a long history of loving this plant. Lamb's quarters is a valuable food plant, but some of the species are considered invasive. It has nutritious greens that are good for salads or stews. The seeds are high in protein and sold in stores now as quinoa. Amaranth also has very nutritious greens and seeds that are very high in protein. It was cultivated by Native Americans and the Aztecs, and it's cultivated worldwide today as a food crop. And now we have various products which started out in health food stores, but are now in general grocery stores for amaranth cereals and so forth. And yet some species are treated as a weed. So I was quite interested in looking at this topic of noxious weeds or invasive plants to find out what was going on with that. And out of that, I created a website that I called Management of Invasive Plants in the Western USA. I interviewed many individuals in Western states who held jobs managing weeds, and I read much research on related topics, trying to put together as complete a picture as I could on how well management of invasive plants was going. What I found out was that different states have different lists of names of what plants are considered invasive plants. And generally, they don't call them invasive plants, they call them noxious plants or noxious weeds, which is kind of a deceptive name because they aren't, most of them are not poisonous. Some are, but most of them are not. So each state throughout the US has a different list of which plants to treat as noxious. And that list is strongly based on how much money is available to manage weeds. For example, in I think it's Oklahoma, only includes about 11 plants on their list of noxious weeds. The state of California has over 200 plants on their list. And that means that's the plants they're going to treat, that they're going to try to get rid of. And on my website, it lists, for the Western states, I created a list comparing their laws and their lists. So you can see how the state laws differ from state to state and how their lists differ from state to state. And I only did the Western states for various reasons, but one of which being I couldn't handle doing all 50 states. Western states was enough to try to do. And then I looked at various federal agencies, and there's actually a lot of federal agencies that have to deal with invasive plants. And their lists also differ from the state lists. So a lot of inconsistency between states and between federal agencies in the states. So this page has a list of all the different federal agencies that have to do something to do with agriculture. And anything that has to do with agriculture has to also figure out how to deal with weeds. A long list of federal offices that have to deal with that. And I've got web links for each of them on with more information, more details. Typically in the states, it's the State Department of Agriculture that hires staff responsible for managing weeds, in other words, plants and pests, such as insects and snails and other kinds of invasive animals or insects in crops and in rangeland. And originally, the work on invasive plants focused on crops, but it quickly also spread to rangeland because ranchers were discovering that invasive plants were creating problems on their lands as well. And the title of this individual, oddly enough, is usually a weed and pest coordinator. Can you imagine having such a title? And I interviewed in most of the states in the West, I interviewed the weed and pest coordinator for that state. And they were very helpful. This is just happens to be to show you the interview. This is Slade Franklin, who is the Wyoming weed and pest coordinator. And I have extensive interviews with each of these individuals, and I transcribed the whole interview so that you have it there. And under this heading on the right, it's got the list of all the interviews, so you can see that. And that's where I really started learning how well this was working. The departments of transportation also have to deal with noxious plants because of all the weeds that grow up on the roadsides of the highways. And so I interviewed in a number of states the person in charge of weed management for the Department of Transportation. So John Sampson was one of the people that I interviewed. So the Western states do work together to some extent to share knowledge. There's actually a number of organizations that collaborate with landowners to manage it, like the Weed Sciences Society of America, the Regional Integrative Pest Management Centers bring people from different states together to collaborate and share their knowledge. So this is a variety of different organizations that do this. And then in a number of the states in the West, but not all of the states, have an invasive species council. The state weed coordinator works with county weed supervisors. So each county, like in Wyoming, for example, has a county weed supervisor, and they all come together for regular meetings and they collaborate with the state weed coordinator. And together they come up with strategies. They get together and they figure out, okay, what's the best way to manage weeds? And if you look at their strategies, their plans for management, the plans look good, and they usually do include the planting of native plants. However, that goes wrong pretty quickly. So this is just a summary of some of that information. The success of their efforts is directly limited by the amount of funding available. And unfortunately, many states just don't have enough money in their state budgets to really tackle this appropriately. And the staff, usually in these strategy plans that each state develops, they recognize that they've got to use herbicides to cut back on the weeds as the first step. And they know it's really the first step. Unfortunately, it's often only a step that really gets into place because that's where money is available. Federal agencies provide funds for herbicides and pesticides. There's not a lot of funds beyond the funds for herbicides and pesticides, and various states don't have enough money to really do much more than that. And so counties often don't get beyond that first step. Agrochemical companies, which by the way are the same petrochemical companies that we hear about with other areas, they're the ones responsible for doing research on the safety and effectiveness of the herbicides, and they do not do adequate research at all on these impacts. And I've got a website just that describes the funding on research. There's many problems that have occurred with herbicides. One is that a lot of the invasive plants develop resistance to the herbicide. That means that after a couple of years of being doused with an herbicide, there's a fairly large number of plants that are resistant and keep growing anyway. That means that the agrochemical companies have to come up with new herbicides. So they're always coming up with new herbicides every few years. And again, I've got a website that describes all these kinds of things. So lots of information in my website. Health impacts are being reported, but health impacts such as the effect of herbicides and pesticides on the humans who administer them, it takes years, sometimes decades, to document the human impacts of these. And it's really hard to get adequate documentation. In the meantime, more and more chemicals are being poured onto crops and onto ranches. And I have extensive information on my website on what we know so far on the impacts of pesticides on the environment and human health. Food safety is now a concern because they've developed herbicides that can be broadcast. Like the first herbicides had to be just put specifically on the noxious weeds, but they developed herbicides, they developed crops that were resistant to the herbicides, and this allowed them to start broadcasting the herbicide. So for example, if you have a field of broccoli, and I don't know if that's an appropriate example, but you have a field of broccoli and you had some weeds in it, you could now spray the entire broccoli crop with an herbicide because it wouldn't kill the broccoli, it would just kill the invasives around the broccoli. But that means that much more of the crops have chemicals on them. And there's a lot of concerns now about pesticide residue in foods. And there's concern about how the chemicals impact the environment, waterways, wildlife, amphibians, and even insects and birds, of course. Baha'u'llah said, "Every man of discernment, while walking upon the earth, feeleth indeed abashed, inasmuch as he is fully aware that the thing which is the source of his prosperity, his wealth, his might, his exaltation, his advancement and power is as ordained by God, the very earth which is trodden beneath the feet of all men. There can be no doubt that whoever is cognizant of this truth is cleansed and sanctified from all pride, arrogance, and vainglory. So here's some pictures of some farms that I got to visit in China. This is actually rapeseed, and rapeseed is used to make canola farm in northern China. And this is a website for a botanical, an organic farm in Montana that I got to visit with Carolyn Jennings' daughter, Rose, who studies sustainable agriculture. Anyway, it's a real interesting website. So, what now? Any questions that you have?
Delena, did you want to take a little break now or a couple of minutes?
Oh, yeah, let's just take a 5-minute break. Yeah.
Yeah. If we could just take a little bit of a break.
I haven't figured out how to raise my hand, Dawn.
Okay.
Recently, it seems to have disappeared. But I had several things that I wanted to ask, way more than I will ask. But one of them is, does she now see a relationship to climate change into what is happening with invasive species? Oh, Delena has left, has she?
Right. She wanted to have just a little bit of a break in between.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. But she'll
Well,
be
I have something else
if we want to talk amongst ourselves, that's fine too.
Well, I have something that just came to mind because I've been thinking a lot about and involved a lot with people who have what we would call disabilities. And if you're looking for language that's different, people who are differently abled. And doesn't this relate to creation? That the creator made all kinds of differently abled plants, and we call them weeds. And that dandelion is an example because during the World War II, when coffee was scarce, my parents roasted the roots of the dandelion for coffee. So it's just something I was thinking about, that if the creator made these, why do we call them weeds?
That's kind of the conclusion I came to as well. And I do have a section on my website. I just pulled it up on the role of native plants. And each organization figures out we've got to start planting natives in here somewhere. But that's sort of like down the list. It's not necessarily what they try to do at the beginning. And it's turning out to be very challenging to get natives back into the ecosystem once they've been disrupted.
Right.
Winnie, a weed is just a plant out of place.
Exactly.
And I think the term invasive is very pejorative. I
Yes.
think you know that if you're a visitor to the United States, you're called an alien. And I think who's invading who here?
Exactly.
Right.
And so I think the term noxious also it's mainly from the standpoint of the farmer, who's growing whatever crop. And that this particular plant, as Bill says, is not compatible with that plant. But in fact, the two, so I think the terminology, there's a built-in, bias there in the terminology, which I just wanted to highlight.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Because I think normally invasive, we think it's something coming like this in the sea. I live on the Great Lakes, and we're getting through the ships. There are invasive species coming in the bilge water of the ships
Yes.
because they're coming from another ecosystem. But some of these invasive plants that you're talking about, Delena, are in fact native, aren't they? They're indigenous.
No,
Yes, there are some plants. In some states, the state actually says, no, you can't call a native plant a noxious weed. But in some states, they do include some native plants on their list of noxious weeds.
folks, I would just ask if you'd like to speak, could you raise your hand? Otherwise, it gets a little chaotic here. Thank you. Winnie, you had some questions to begin with. You said you couldn't find how to raise your hand.
Well, I just did see it. It comes in, my technology is not very good. I think I've made a comment. Let's hear from other people now.
Okay. Jay? I can't hear you, Jay. You got to unmute.
Yeah, I was muted. Okay.
Okay.
We have what we call invasive plants in the South, and they're horrible. They choke out the wildlife. We have Chinese privet and kudzu. I know in kudzu has a good usage, but we have too much of it, so we haven't been able to turn it into making tea or anything out of it. But it kills the good plants and it chokes out the native habitats. So, but I love dandelions. So, anyway, I just wanted to put that out there that not all invasive plants are good.
Right.
Yeah, and kudzu is an example. It's a really important plant in Japan where it's from. And in Japan, it's a food and they make paper out of it. It's got multiple uses, so it's very valuable there, but it's become terribly invasive in the southeastern states.
Right. And I was mentioning to Delena earlier that I battle with the English ivy here. It's just unstoppable. And it climbs trees and kills trees. So depending on where you live, I don't have any problem calling it invasive.
Yeah.
Extremely.
Yeah, and most of the plants that we consider to be noxious weeds were brought here on purpose. They were brought here as food or as just ornamental plants. And once they were out of their natural environment, in some cases, not all introduced plants have become noxious at all. Quite a few have not. But it's really hard to predict which plants will become noxious like that.
Bill?
Yeah, hi, Delena. I farm organically in Ontario. I have since 1998. And initially we had beef cows, so we had hay and we had, hay in the rotation. It was really easy, relatively easy to control perennial weeds. But lately we've gotten, as I aged, I've gotten rid of the cows, but still cropping. And it's in the perennial weeds, i.e. in our area, Canada thistle and field bindweed are the bane of organic existence. And I can control them, but it takes tillage, which is not good for the soil. Yeah. So I'm just, do you have any organic Roundup?
What was your question?
Do you have any thoughts on controlling perennials organically, perennial weeds?
Well, okay, on my website, I'll show you the section. There's a whole section called Innovative Solutions.
Okay.
And it addresses different things people are trying to do. And it lists, for example, agricultural best practices, talks about grazing, rangeland restoration, and habitat conservation. And under agricultural best practices, there's a long list of things, such as intercropping, perennial crops, soil solarization, natural farming, organic farming, permaculture. And it has a number of examples of types of tillage you can do that's less likely to cause weeds. And the thing with many invasive plants is that the annuals are more of a problem. Well, let me take that back. Many of our crops are annuals in that they're grown for a few months and then they're dug up. So growing perennial crops helps to reduce the amount of invasive plants that come in because you're not digging up the whole crop every year. And there's an organization in Kansas called the Land Institute, LAND, and I have a nephew who is working there as a geneticist. This organization is developing perennial grains as alternative crops for farmers who are currently using annual grains. And by just simply using perennial grains in their fields, then they're not tilling up the soil every year. And that helps quite a bit.
Yeah, that would help with competition for the perennial noxious weeds as well.
Right, right. Yeah. Yeah. So
Okay.
this is a long list with lots of examples of each of the items that I mentioned.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Delena, I don't know whether you want to stop sharing or do you have more to show on your website?
Well, if there's any more questions, I could, there's a couple more things I can show you, but go ahead and keep asking questions.
Okay. Yeah, I just wondered if you wanted to stop sharing so the screen could be we could see each other better, maybe.
Well,
It's
leave
up
the
to you.
screen because as people ask questions, I
Okay,
take them to the place on the website where they
Okay,
can
great.
get the answers.
all right. Rose?
Yes. Oh, thank you so much. I just would like to say thank you so much for all the contributions you've made over time. I'm very grateful, and I'm going to look up your book. It looks like it would be very helpful. I would just like to say that the state of Oregon is currently providing funding for native plant nurseries right now, and for greening, conservation greening. And so we're being offered up to $500,000 to expand our native plant nursery that we're doing. We have a weed commission out here, and they provide funding to some of our partners, local watershed councils that are seeking grants. And I would just like to say that those partners love working with Native American partners. So our teams go out and work. One day they removed 920 pounds of Ledwigia from a wetlands up at the North Santiam watershed, excuse me. I just want to say, have you had an opportunity to work with Native people and tribes where you've been working, and have you found it to be helpful?
I have not myself. But is there, yeah, anyone else out there that is doing so?
Well, yes, because we found that our partners, it really strengthens their hope to work with Native, our Native American nonprofit, because we're so positive. We do not say the word impossible because we're positive. We just keep on working, and even if it takes longer, we're removing invasives without any sprays or toxins. And so I think a lot of what Native people can contribute is that positive attitude that nothing will stop us from continuing to be successful in the eradication of natives and to strengthen our native plant species. We replace them with native plant species. I just think that that attitude is really important, and I'm sure that you have the same attitude being a Baha'i.
Yeah, it's very important to have partnerships with tribes and any other organization to collaborate and problem solve together.
Great. Bo? Bo, you'll need to unmute. Bo, are you there?
Okay, now can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm speaking to two uniquely, and I will use the word invasives in Michigan.
One is called crown vetch, which I understand originally got its start in Pennsylvania as one of their DOT efforts to control embankments, which it does. But from there, oh my gosh, it is one of those plants that it just takes over, kills all the native plants in areas where we used to have trillium and bloodroot and you name it. There's nothing now but mass of, I think it's kind of like kudzu, except it doesn't climb so high. And it has the unique horror of not only does it spread extensively via seeds from these pretty little pink flowers, but it also has root systems that are about 6 feet. They run 6 feet under the ground, sending out runners that then pop up everywhere. That's one that I would like to hear more about, any efforts that have been made, and I'll do research if you have web links. The other one is Russian olive, taking over wherever there used to be small brush and lower growing bushes and things. Russian olive does the same thing in our woodlands that the crown vetch does in any square inch of property. It lives in any soil, etc. And extensive efforts have been made, not with the crown vetch to my knowledge, but with Russian olive, and it's none have been successful.
So we have Russian olive here in Montana. And then there's a plant, some of you might be familiar with salt cedar in particularly along the Rio Grande River, there's a lot of salt cedar. And some of these plants have been in our local ecosystem so long now that they've become a part of that ecosystem.
Wow.
And for example, with salt cedars, they discovered that an endangered warbler, I think it's the willow warbler, was nesting in the salt cedar, and they had to quit cutting back the salt cedar because of that. And something else to take into account is that the same attributes of the plant that make it such a problem also explain why we brought them here in the first place. So a number of native plants were brought here to be soil stabilizers and things like that. And the problem is we can't predict how they're going to behave once they're in our ecosystem. So many of them have been here for over 100 years. And if you remove them from the ecosystem, it's very, very challenging to replace them with native species. And another problem is that there's not a lot of places you can buy native seed, and it takes a long time to reintroduce native plants into an area. So it's a huge challenging issue.
Right. Okay. There's a question here in the chat from Mark. Is it practical to remove invasive weeds manually on a large scale, or are herbicides necessary?
It's very, very difficult to do that, and a lot of organizations have realized that they have to start out with herbicides. But you really need to read the sections on my website about herbicides, which is pretty extensive information, to realize what we're up against with that.
Okay.
And for one thing, the fact that plants become, and weeds become resistant to herbicides, and then they have to keep creating new herbicides, which is, again, more money, more money, more money. So I give, for example, with agriculture, I have lots of examples of the issues of using herbicides. So yeah, read through those sections
Right,
to see about that.
right. Okay, Claire?
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. I wanted to ask you about a particular project I'm working on. It actually speaks a little to Mark's question. I'm working on a pilot project with a couple different nonprofits under power lines in Georgia, so southeast. And one of the things we're doing is manual removal of invasive species, specifically kudzu, privet, and some English ivy, but it's really mainly kudzu. And the LLC that I'm participating under the umbrella of my LLC, which is focused on soil and soil regeneration and soil microbes. And so I was particularly curious, in addition to manual removal, we're also doing just propagating native species as we manually remove the invasives and doing some intercropping. But I was curious about any suggestions or research you've done on soil specifically, anything you might recommend as far as soil amendments. I'm curious if soil amendments might actually be harmful because they might encourage invasive populations. But my hope was that if we put in compost, mulch, biochar with native seeds, maybe they'll give the natives a helping hand. And our goal by year 3 is to really get this to kind of a native perennial permaculture state such that you would get no reincursion by invasives. But I'm curious what, if any, recommendations you'd have on the soil front.
Yeah, I'm not very knowledgeable about that particular aspect. But I did think of something while you're asking that. Now, let me think a second. Go back to this. Because soil solarization is mentioned here. But what you have to realize, so if we have a crop, or if we're in rangeland and we remove plants, we remove native or invasive plants.
Mm-hmm.
Invasive plants become invasive because they're very good at filling in the void.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to think of plants as doing their job. So think of an invasive plant as doing its job. It's doing its job to go into an area and have something growing as quickly as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And even though some of these plants become a problem once they start doing it, if you don't think of them as the bad guys, but you think of them as organisms that are trying to save the soil. They're trying to save
Mm-hmm.
the system. Because if you strip an area from its invasive plants, then you're going to start losing soil like crazy.
Yeah.
So, and it does take so long. Okay, I'll give you a really bizarre example. There was in Montana, in Butte, Montana, there's a large copper mine in Butte, Montana, and there was a flood about 60 years ago that carried toxic chemicals from the water ponds
Mm-hmm.
there and flooded the whole area on Silverbow Creek, which is a creek that runs from Butte down into the Big Hole River and goes all the way to Missoula. And they found that they wanted to repair this area because there was nothing that would grow. And it was because there were these toxic minerals growing along the banks of the creek and the river. And they tried just planting all other plants in there, and the plants wouldn't grow because they found out they had to first amend the soil. They had to get rid of all the toxic chemicals first. And that was a huge, huge task, was trying to restore good soil to the area. And then they put in, I've forgotten what plant they started with, but they started with a non-native plant that they knew would grow real fast. And then they realized, oh, now what we've done, we created an invasive
Mhm.
system. And then they thought, well, we really want native plants. And they found out that there was not enough native seed available in the state of Montana to reseed that area like they wanted to do. So it
Wow.
was a multi-year project that cost lots of money and did not perform as they had hoped.
Mm.
So there's always a lot of problems when you don't take into account every aspect of it, the soil, the condition of the soil, and so forth.
Great.
Hmm.
Christine was having trouble raising her hand. She has a question. Christine?
Thank you. Yes. With the word invasive, I think, there are both native plants and alien plants that can, under circumstances, become a problem for the balance of the ecosystems because they spread and they displace native plants. And I just want to mention one species in the context of what Vinny said at the beginning, with the impacts of climate change. In our yard here in Rhode Island, we used to have actually poison ivy is quite large spread in Rhode Island, but it has in the past it was kind of contained, and it spread mainly by roots, and we had it like at the border of our yard, but it was easily controlled because it just spread by root, no problem. And it started about 10 years ago that it spreads by seed now. So I get tiny poison ivy plants all over our yard. So it starts early in the spring, I dig out by hand. Maybe I see one, then I think, okay, let's see. And then I see 3 more. I go out and try to dig them out. I see there are a few more. And then later in the season, I get like 38 or 39 on one day. And just in the backyard, and then I see them in the front, and now it's more than 100 plants I dig out by hand every year just in our yard. And that is, I think it is because of climate change, the warmer temperatures, and sorry, the more CO2 in the air fertilizes the poison ivy, and it spreads. And I can see it also in fields here and in the woods and in other people's yards. It's all over.
Yeah, and you gave an example of a native plant that has become invasive. So I'll give you another example of that. In central Texas, there's a native tree called ash juniper, and it's native to the area, but it used to be fairly uncommon. It wasn't everywhere. And then as ranching and farming came in and native plants were removed, the ash juniper started spreading. And junipers have pollen that's wind pollinated, they're wind pollinated plants, and ash juniper has the most toxic pollen of any of the junipers. And it's become a huge health issue in central Texas because it causes so many allergies and asthma there. But it's a native plant. And so now the state of Texas is dealing with, oh, let's remove this native plant. Well, then you remove the native plant, something else is going to try to come in. So I think we have to change, a number of you pointed out that we have to kind of change the way we think about these plants. And I think of them as they're trying to do the job that we're failing to do. We're creating voids in the ecosystem, and any plants are trying to come in and get rid of that absence of ground cover, absence of plants. And we've decided which ones we like and don't like.
Right.
And with climate change, I even have a section in here on climate change, because as climate change keeps progressing, then the whole ecosystems are going to change. So I pose the question that it could be some of these invasive plants that can survive in climate change. So maybe we should be rethinking how we treat so-called weeds and consider their adaptability may enable them to survive climate change.
Right. Carol?
Yes, thank you for all this information. I'm originally from Utah, and I'm not living there now and haven't for a while. But anyway, I've been reading over the years that the BLM has been doing mass cleaning chains of the pinyon pine and the juniper. And I've never understood this because these are indigenous plants or trees that hold the soil down and do all kinds of other things and provide a lot of food for animals and even other people. And so do you have any understanding as to why they're doing this and then just leaving barren ground that the soil, what soil there is and the sand and everything else can blow around?
I had not heard of that project. Do you know where that's occurring?
It's occurring in several places in southern Utah. I couldn't tell you specifically, but I don't know if it's occurring in any of the national parks, but some of them are close to the national parks. And there's been a lot of controversy over it, and there's been several local and semi or national organizations trying to get the BLM to change their policy. And I think they've been considering change, but I haven't heard whether they have. But Southern Utah SUA, Utah Wilderness Association, and several other organizations are involved with trying to influence the BLM to stop doing this. Because I mean, I don't know the environment that well, but I've spent a lot of time in that area, backpacking and camping and stuff. And it's such a fragile area, and it's so spectacular. And then to take away two of the major native trees just doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. My guess is that because of grazing, a lot of native cover in southern Utah, I live in the sagebrush steppe, and I believe southern Utah is also sagebrush. And so with grazing, there's been a lot of removal of the native sagebrush and so forth. And so my guess is the pinyons and junipers have expanded their range. And
well, I think
so we've created this problem, and now we're making the problem worse.
And I agree, some of it is for grazing. But considering what amazes me is that the BLM is doing this, who's supposed to take care of ground and land, and that everyone knows, and certainly the BLM knows, that the western states are getting drier and drier, and Utah is the second driest state in the country.
Yeah.
And do this, you know. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah, it's a problem for sure.
Jay?
Yep, I was muted. Okay, I was going to try to help with the removal of kudzu and other invasives. But I have had experience at removing that out of manually from an area that was as large as an acre. And the site had existing trees, but we manually removed it thoroughly as we could during this time of the year when the plant's getting ready to go dormant. And after doing a real thorough job of removing it, then we just look for what comes up in the spring and then remove it again. And then, watch it for a year or two. And if you have to spray, but the timing is important. If you tried to remove it in the middle of the summer, it would grow back immediately. So that's one bit of advice. And we use crown vetch in coal mine reclamation. I feel sorry for you for having to get rid of that. I think it's a lagoon, and somebody was talking about the soils that kudzu and crown vetch are both lagoons. That's all. I just wanted to see if that experience about removing the kudzu would help anybody.
Thanks, Jay. Holians?
Uh, Thank you so much for the presentation. I'm curious to find out if there are options that people are exploring either for biocontrol or finding useful means or ways to use the invasive species. Because, for example, here in Kenya, we've been dealing with some of invasive species. For example, in Lake Victoria, this water hyacinth that wiped a lot of native species, including fish species. And there was a time when the lake was not navigable for all the three East African countries. However, lately we've been exploring to use water hyacinth for various reasons, including feed for livestock, to using it as a feed material for biogas and things like that. Then there was also another one which was introduced by FAO, I think in the 60s, to stabilize degrading soils in the mid of Rift Valley area, prosopis. And so it has quite high calorific value. So it's been used to produce charcoal for charcoal production. It's also, now there are people now exploring using it as to make biochar and use for various ways. So I don't know if people are trying to explore, because that's now what we are finding to be quite sustainable.
So water hyacinth is a very interesting example. And in Texas, it's considered an invasive plant as well. But they have recently discovered that water hyacinth is a great water filter, and they're now using it. I believe it's Austin, Texas, sewage treatment plant is using water hyacinth as one of their stages of treating the water before they dump it back into rivers.
Wow. That's really interesting. Yeah, I think that's it. Part of it is trying to find a use for all these different, everything has a purpose, right?
Yeah.
Right. Arthur?
His comments reminded me, I've got a section on biocontrols and the challenges of using like certain insects, for example, that will eat invasive plants. So quite a bit of information on that and the challenges of doing that. So just another section.
Right. Arthur?
I've been managing a couple of acres of forest for the last 20 years, and I've seen that with climate change, some things that weren't a problem in the past have really become, quite difficult. I mean, English ivy, I think, has been there for a very long time and grows up some of the trees, but it's now carpeting much of the forest floor and crowding out all of the lilies and other wildflowers that used to be there. And recently, there's been a variety of bramble of blackberry that is extremely aggressive, that wasn't there at all 20 years ago, and now it's spreading all over the place, and it sort of arches down and roots itself and arches down, so it's spreading vegetatively all through the forest and creating impenetrable thickets that these weren't there 20 years ago. But I think either they've recently crept in, or with climate change, I suspect the ivy may have been killed off by the winter freezes. But with so little freezing in the winter, it's now able to spread on the ground much more than it could before. So it's partly climate change, partly the coming in. So this is the middle of France. This is in Europe. But it's again, just living with the forest long enough, you can see where the invasives are coming in and really upsetting the balance in the forest. Thank you.
Thank you. Evali?
Yes, water hyacinth is also a problem here in Zimbabwe and Lake Kariba. But on the other hand, the mayor of Bulawayo was speaking the other day about the problems with our antiquated sewage systems. So that information about possibly using water hyacinth in some of the ponds could be very useful. Our problem is not, anyway, we don't recognize many of the herbaceous species as problematic here. Ours are mostly lantana, the jacaranda, syringa, exotic plants that were brought in probably more for gardens, and especially the lantana in the Matobo Hills, where you have huge water runoff when it does rain, which isn't very frequent. We're in a drought-stricken area, comes off the granite kopjes. We have these wetlands, these flays that should be big sponges that hold water and slowly dribble it out. But what happens when people have planted the eucalyptus and the lantana just goes crazy by itself, it drains those wetlands. And then the people in the villages and down through the runoff do not get a yearly supply of water anymore.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and lantana during the colonial times, it was really attacked, and they hired villagers to help control it. And now that there's no governmental funds for that under the current government, then it is just gone everywhere, anywhere in Matobo National Park, Matobo Hills, and down through our area. It's become a huge, huge problem. So yeah, most of ours, I was going to ask earlier, most of yours, when you call it weeds, you were speaking of herbaceous plants, I believe.
Yes, but there's a lot of, it's mostly herbaceous that are on the list, but there are some trees and shrubs that are on the list. And I was in Matopo National Park in the spring, by the way.
Oh, seriously? Why did you not look us up?
Well, I was on a Rhodes Scholar tour, so I was a captive audience.
But we just had our annual general meeting of the Matobo Conservation Society last Sunday. So we're trying to participate in local conservation here as well.
Wonderful.
Great.
So this photograph I have up right now is kind of embodies the way I have come to think of invasive plants. Okay, what needs to change is not so much the plants, but the humans. This is a completely barren area that was created by humans. It's just a dump site. And I have this idea of the kochia, which is considered a really nasty invasive plant in Montana. I look at it and I go, oh, the kochia sees this big bare ground. Like, oh my God, we have to save the soil. We have to save the ground. Hurry, rush in. Oh, so anyway, I'm trying to change people's mindset about invasive plants. Because what we're doing isn't working. And we don't have the funds to do better. And so I want us to start thinking about what's the other choice? Can we accept the invasives and think about what they're trying to do to save the earth? Anyway, something to think about.
Thanks. Rose?
Oh, yes, thank you so much. So we have dealt with water hyacinth in the Willamette Valley, and we developed a partnership with Willamette River Keepers who spent 3 years spraying and removing. Now they've moved on to another section to work on, and we have stepped in with our canoes. Our teams go down with canoes and manually remove them because we do not believe that water hyacinth is ever a good idea anywhere except where it originated. What happened in the Willamette Valley and like in Willamette Slough is that year after year, layers of Ledwiggia would come and no one removed it. And so it got to the point where people could almost walk across the slough over the top. It became so thick. And what was underneath all that was native plant species called wapato. Now that's called Indian potato in English. The wapato was a bulb that Indian tribes ate, and they would spend weeks and weeks in the late summer after the water had subsided from the wetlands, and they would go in and pick thousands and thousands of pounds of wapato, and it was a common food. We're working to restore wapato, so we are manually removing, and I really truly believe that you can restore an environment with the right attitude and with manual removal. We did accept the fact that Willamette River keepers had sprayed for 3 or 4 years, but for the same, now that we're starting to come in, we're going to be doing testing to see if the wapato underneath all of that invasive is deadly, if it absorbs some of the chemicals from the sprays. But I truly believe that it is possible to remove invasives from a species. Many times you can look at those foreign species, such as the blackberries that was just referred to, because it's a powerful medicine. The root of those blackberries can actually remove heavy metals from the soil, so it does have value, but it overtakes the natives. And so we have succeeded on my farm in removing almost all of the blackberries, just one section left. And so I think that if we just keep on with a positive attitude and keep constantly removing, that we can be successful. I just want to say it's important for us to always maintain a sense of hope in the work we're doing. So I hope that that makes sense to you. It might be slightly different than what you're recommending. And I don't ever like to contradict anybody, but I just wanted to share that thought if it's all right. Thank you for listening.
Yeah, definitely. That's all extremely important. Yeah, it would be absolutely wonderful if we could restore native ecosystems. But then the question is, will those native ecosystems survive climate change?
Right. So there's a comment here from Holiance about herbicides. It said most herbicides destroy non-target plant species, which may only create bareness that invasive species will thrive in. So that's the thing. I think when you lose the cover, then you've got to immediately have something there.
Yeah.
Jay?
Right. So we talk about sustainable development, and I think we'll be talking about restorative development, that we can restore these lands, and some invasive plants or some non-indigenous plants are very useful. They can be drought resistant, and they can be some of the most beautiful plants that we have are imported from all over the world, but some of them cause a big problem. And so, again, I think restoring the landscapes and using the plants in the most appropriate way. We talked earlier about that a weed is any plant growing where you don't want it. And so some of these non-indigenous plants cause problems, and some of them can be very helpful. But with somewhere down the road with the New World Order, we'll be restoring landscapes and using plants for their most productive use.
Right.
Oh.
Thank you.
Oh, I got one more thing. The English ivy is not that invasive. Y'all can take it out with just a little bit of hard work. Hire some guys and rip it out. It's not like kudzu or some of these other plants that really are hard to manage. And I don't think the freeze is causing the English ivy to grow. I don't think freeze hurts the English ivy. But anyway, that's that.
Thanks, Jay. I did want to mention, I was talking with Delena before we started about, I'd recently, past couple of years, I've watched Doug Tallamy. I don't know if people are familiar with him. He has a book out called Bringing Nature Home. And his idea is that, everyone who has some space, has some land around their house, those of us who have yards or have land, can do something in order to bring back the native species, because his whole thing is about, and he's a professor of entomology, so he's looking at insects and the ecosystems, and it's very interesting. So if you don't have the native plants, we all know this about pollinators, we're all kind of very much aware of pollinators, but there are lots of, thousands of other insects who depend on native species and keystone species such as oak trees in our area. Oak trees are a keystone species. But if you don't have those insects, then it affects that whole web of life, that whole food web. And it's just very interesting to see how each part of an ecosystem depends on those plants, and then the insects, and then the other animals that feed on those insects, and then the other animals that feed on those animals, and that it's this whole web of life, really. And
Yeah.
so he's got this program where he calls it's called Homegrown National Park. You can look up his website, and he's encouraging people to, because we have so few, our native and wild spaces are going to be becoming so much smaller, and that in order to restore the ecosystems, we can all kind of do something if we have a yard, if we have a garden, things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, this photograph is an example of a restored prairie in near Houston, Texas. It's a area that's a native prairie, and they were able to create the Katy Prairie Conservancy. So it's land that was bought by the Nature Conservancy and is now a native grass preserve.
Right. So, any other comments or questions?
Well, I do want to always give a plug for the fact that we have an administrative order that is unique to the world. And so much of what we've talked about here, for instance, Delena said that the state and the federal agencies don't always have the same policy. If we get involved in our local governments in regard to some issues like this, perhaps we can do something on the local level and understand how important the governments are, because they hold the money and they make the policies. And we aren't going to get ahead in most any regard unless we understand that.
Right.
Lots of good solutions in the works. And this site just gives some examples of places where they've been embedding natural habits. So like, so you have a crop, and in between the crop rows, you have rows with native plants. And that helps with the insects. It brings in more of the insects that are gonna pollinate the crops, and so forth. So there's some other more ideas like that.
So much information on your website. Really wonderful. Wonderful resource. Neil, did you have
something to read on the weekend?
These sessions are just wonderful. And Delena, your presentation was so perfect in expanding our knowledge of something that we didn't know very much about. And you join a distinguished list of presenters here. I think one or two are still on this call. And you have entered the pantheon of these presenters. And,
oh yeah, it's wonderful to hear people from all over the world.
Exactly. And some people came on this call from Zimbabwe who we've never had before, I think, and people from Haiti. And I think that this space is proving to be quite amazing. And, thanks to Dawn, who's kind of the hub of it. But I'm just in awe of how beautiful these presentations are. And I'm an agricultural journalist. I interview farmers a lot and I write their stories. And I just want to say, I noticed that you're a professor emerita. So as a journalist, what are you going to do with the rest of your life, kind of thing? You don't have to go into that too much.
Well, this is the project I took on as I was retiring. So I retired in 2018. And in the fall of 2017, I started doing my interviews for this project. So it's been what I've been doing in retirement. And there's lots more interviews to add to it when I finally get around to that.
Wonderful.
The interviews have been more revealing than anything else because it's the people working in the field that know all the ins and outs. Like one of the the county supervisors in Wyoming told me that the chemical companies come in and they say, oh, we've got this new herbicide and it's the answer to all your problems. And then we buy into this new herbicide and then other plants become resistant to it. And it's just a new problem every year. And so they have a very jaded attitude towards the whole hype from the agrochemical companies and so forth. So it's really, really revealing to actually read some of these interviews.
Yes. Holiance, did you have something?
Yeah, I wanted to add, particularly for our agricultural ecosystems, we really have to reconsider reintroducing the biodiversity that was there within some of these ecosystems. Because when you look, for example, in natural savanna, where there's still diversity of plants and grazers, and you hardly find this problem. However, when you look at our agricultural system these days, even where we have ranches, you just find like huge ranches of either just cattle alone or sometimes sheep or goats. So with this selective kind of feeding, so some other species like now, from what I hear, also some of the native species have started becoming, are now being labeled noxious. And that only happens in a system where now whatever was eating them are no longer in the space, and now the population just keeps on growing without much control. However, for us here, oftentimes most of the invasive species were literally introduced, so some of them don't even have anything that would control their population, and that's why people have started, okay, let's find other ways we are going to manage them, because for us there's barely any government putting resources to try to control them. So after it has destroyed people's livelihood, people are like, let's find a way out of this. And I think the more we explore how we are going to live with them, because ideally, like you put up that picture, oftentimes also they also provide us a service, because when we expose an area, maybe out of construction, sometimes accidents or anything, then they come and invade the place and make it suitable for other species to later on come and grow and thrive within that.
It's been a real honor for me to get to talk with people from all over the world. I'm blown away by this.